Let's jump in, because the U.S. companies can't. They are really prohibited. So they may stay, they may spend another 10 years watching the tourist business disappear into other hands, or the supply of this, or the production of that. All those people in the rice states, in the cattle states that are just, rubbing their hands, because they used to have the Cuban rice trade. Why would Cuba have to turn to Vietnam when they can just float it down from Mississippi? Those guys have to see other countries take their place, and have to see Cuba begin to replace the imports and produce the rice themselves, and so on. It's a very interesting time to live. This is something truly I had not expected to see in my life. I thought I would die before there would be a change. But it's happening with the help of the world. It's not just that Cuba changed. It's not just that Obama wanted to change it. The circumstances said it's changed. It's synchronicity of the moment said change. So that is the end of my presentation. I'll be happy to talk some more if you have questions or comments.
Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, maybe 2 years ago, I would have felt really hopeful about this moving forward, even a 10-year. But with the tenor of this upcoming presidential election and extreme conservatism, I mean, can you see any possibility that it won't be actually 20 or 30 years before normalizing relations or creating a real free communication?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's lots of factors that you can't really call. You can't predict how they're going to play out. One is who is opposing the Republicans. So before, until recently, it was going to be a coronation for Hillary, and she had announced that she was against her own policy as of a few years back. She had renounced that, and she was one of the people most affected negatively by the failure of Sunsuneo and the Allen Rose thing. But now she's not a shoo-in. So do the Democrats have a strong candidate? Can they field a strong candidate to compete against? Well, do the Republicans can they field a strong candidate? Right now they have a bunch of people that are going up and down every day, that things change. And there's another factor that's quite interesting. One of the major supporters of change to Cuba is the group of companies and corporations that have been waiting for years to get into Cuba. That includes organizations like the Chamber of Commerce, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a very conservative organization that for years have been advocating, let's get in there. It includes machinery like Caterpillar, and the kind of things that Cubans really need, everything that has to do with hardware and paint and like that, Cubans really need. All kinds of tourism, all kinds of business people want in. And business people tend to be more Republican than Democrat. And they are quite willing to say, yeah, okay, so it's a Communist Party, right? Well, China has a Communist Party, Vietnam has a Communist Party, so has another party like that. And Saudi Arabia are terrible people. So what's the problem with Cuba? We want the money. And they're very clear on that. So they will support it. And so people like Marco Rubio, who are now representing the rump, the remaining hard line of kill Cuba, overthrow Cuba, they're not getting support. They're not going to get money from these other groups unless these other groups get a promise that things will change. On the other hand, maybe even those groups will become irrelevant when elections are just openly bought by the Coach brothers or the Walmart brothers, the Wall family, and why look for money for a bunch of sources when you can get it from 7 gazillionaires? And they might be against, they might be for. It's hard to say. Just,
Yeah. Two things. I had a little trouble hearing you, so I missed what you said about what was the reason that the U.S. Was allowed to keep control of Guantanamo. And my second question is, how much acceptance is there for the idea that the U.S. engineered that explosion of the USS Maine?
let's take the Maine first. I haven't seen any absolutely clear conclusion. It appears that it just exploded because it was messy, because somebody wasn't taking care of what was going on, because the design was crazy, because it had on one side the motor compartments and the other side the munitions. So if there was the slightest crossing of a spark there, it was going to blow up. It's not been clear. I've read many investigations, including like National Geographic and the expedition of this and that, and it's not clear. But it is pretty clear, I think, that it was not something that Spain did. And Spain the Spanish crown would not have been so stupid as to blow up the Maine when they were in the middle of such touchy circumstances. So either it just happened, or the U.S. did it, but there's no proof that the U.S. did it. As to Guantanamo, there was, as part of the discussion for achieving this pseudo independence, there were a number of things that were required by the U.S. and to be inserted into the Cuban Constitution, the new Constitution. One of those required a parallel set of treaties. And one treaty was that there would be a lease of Guantanamo, and the U.S. would take Guantanamo base. The form it took was of a lease, which is not like your apartment's lease. Your apartment, when the lease is up, you leave, or the owner says, get out. The contract says, on these conditions, you get out. The lease between the U.S. and Cuba was phrased so that henceforth, after this lease is commenced, it may be ended only by the mutual agreement of the parties, which in practical term means whenever the heck the U.S. wants out. And that's the only sequence. Or when Cuba and the U.S. actually do agree to do that, maybe 50 years from now. But for right now, it's just existing. It's what in law is called the contract of, what is the contract of adhesion? It's like, sign this, yes or yes. Because the asymmetries are so huge, it's not a fair contract. And if it were a commercial contract, it would be deemed void and illegal because you can't, it's a gun to your head kind of contract. Sign this, please.
And Cuba has encashed the...
And the checks, ever since the revolution came to power, the measly $4,000 that the U.S. has been paying for the lease of this
You
huge
pay it every
block
month
of
or
Oriente,
every year?
the Cuban said
every month or every year?
every year.
Every year.
And I heard that the government of Cuba, they didn't cash the checks.
No.
No, it just,
So what do they do with the money?
they're saving them as a historical exhibit.
Okay.
No, we are.
It would be good either.
Well, he was first and then you met.
Yes, can
He
you,
was quick. He was first.
I'm sorry.
He'd been waiting, then I'll go back there.
What interests me is the right wing and what I call the neo-fascists are always talking about no freedom under Castro. They never talk about Batista. If Batista was halfway a Democrat, Fidel would be up in the mountains. still trying to stimulate people. Batista, who we supported, was the cause of why Castro was necessary. If not Fidel himself, then some other revolutionary would have to come. The ignorance of the American people vis-a-vis history and geography never ceases to astound me.
There's the triumph of the ideology of American exceptionalism declares that the U.S. was pure from the beginning when it began the genocide of the Indians, and then when it brought in African slaves. And all men were created equal except some who were not equal, and so on. Up to there, to in recent times, becoming the defender of good governance and of democracy and of freedom everywhere, especially in the Americas. At the time when that was going on, in the 1950s, let's say, let's put it this way really quickly. In 1953, the CIA overthrew the
What about?
Iranian government purely for the oil. Purely for the oil, because the British and the US were going to divvy it up. And the result of that mess is still in place today.
Right.
The next year, 1954, Alfredo Stroessner, Paraguay, declared himself the Supremo over there, just took over power, and he lasted like 30 years. This guy, most people have never heard of him here. This guy was like the tropical Caligula. This guy was so incredibly corrupt and awful, and the place was just torture all over the place, and contraband was, anyway. He was cool. There was Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. He had been there for 30 years. The U.S. had put him in at the beginning. There were the Somoza dynasty in Nicaragua. First, the first guy, the general Anastasio, who was followed by Luis, and then little Anastasio Tachito. The first one had begun his reign as when he became the head of the armed forces, and he got there because the U.S. had insisted that he be named the head of the armed forces. The dictatorship of the Duvaliers had come up in the 50s also. None of these had been under threat by the United States. The OAS did not suspend anybody for bad behavior. And in South America, well, in the 70s, after, say by 1976, there was in Bolivia the dictatorship of General Hugo Banzer. In Paraguay, there was still Alfredo Stroessner. In Chile, there was a fascist military junta. In Uruguay, there was a fascist military junta. In Argentina, there was a fascist military junta. And I know, in fact, at least Chile and Uruguay were helped along by the U.S. I'm not sure of the evidence in Argentina, but to them, Mr. Kissinger said, we understand what you are trying to do, but please hurry up and get it over with because we are getting some flack over here. And then there were more dictatorships in Brazil and in
Guatemala.
and the
Let's speak
plant
about Cuba now.
Huh?
Let's speak about Cuba now.
Let's do what?
What's the impact going to be of U.S. citizens being able to travel to Cuba?
Okay, let me get to that because after that, the two ladies back here to whom I promised I would be.
A quick question. So the lease of Guantanamo, is it kind of like what the lease of the Panama Canal was?
I'm not sure what the terms of the Panama Canal was, but I suppose so.
Because, you know, it was a lease. Torrijos and Carter came together to say, we're going to end this lease.
Right.
But it was a process that the Panamanians followed with Kennedy and several presidents.
I think
So
it was
I
in.
recommend the Cubans should look to the Panamanians for that example on how to
Well,
get that.
the Panamanians were about to engage in war against the US. Torrijos was really fighting them. In fact, he ordered, let's not get into that. That history.
Right, but anyhow,
But
so I just
Panama
wanted
and
to
Cuba did
bring that
have,
up.
both were permanent leases, unlike other leases, like the British on Hong Kong. There's a lot of people who still think, oh, after 100 years, it expires. No, it was not the case in Panama, it's not the case.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think my question is actually might be the same as Ellen was going to ask. If the embargo is totally lifted and the US companies and corporations all go rushing in there to make money, do you think, can you give any sort of prognosis or opinion as to whether it's likely that all the gains of the revolution in terms of healthcare for all, good education for all those things, is there going to be a danger that they'll all get dismantled, as tends to happen in capitalist societies?
Right. There's going to be a lot of dialectical activity around this, dialectical figuring out where does this go with which direction and so on. It's not only that there's going to be the possibility of heavy investment presence of U.S. business, it's that at the same time, the reforms approved by the Cuban government have created a much larger space for private enterprise in Cuba. And they will, that is a factor that will of course relate to U.S. investment because, for example, a lot of them have families in the U.S. And there's already a whole lot of under the table trade where people here are setting up family businesses in Cuba, where the family in Cuba handles the business and then people here send money and supplies and stuff like that. And at some point, small business relates to mid-size business, and then there's vertical connections and to banks. At some point, somebody's going to be looking for money, more money to finance the expansion of businesses. As I mentioned before, I don't think that Cuba is going to become just another neoliberal island like Dominican Republic or a little country like Costa Rica where you just ask Washington, what can we do? And they'll say, here's what we do. They will have their own position. They will be interested in a number of things, a number of kinds of investments and amounts to be invested by people from the U.S. And that kind of investment is never made just to be nice. It's an investment to get your investment back and then start bringing in your profit. So there's definitely going to be a back and forth between the expectations of capital and investors on one hand, and the expectations of a socialist society that up to now has been remarkably egalitarian on the basis of a state that helps everybody and people that help each other and so on. That last part is certainly going to be affected, and it is already being affected to some degree. The people who have the very successful paladares, the restaurants, for example, is like the main exhibit of, whoa, this is really successful, really quick. Those folks are making a lot of money. They're living comfortably, and from some things I've read, you can see them showing up in high-class clubs, and they've got their iPods and stuff like that. And they are not really into the farm workers in Camagüey, or the people in the Sierra Maestra who still have not gotten electricity hooked up to their village way up there. And although the company is on the way to get it there, the owners of these businesses are thinking about, when do I open my second one? Maybe when do I turn it into a whatever it is, what connections can I make with the US, sure that's there. The family factor is important. The family factor, that is who sends money from the US and for what, depends in part of who was living in what house at the time of the revolution. There has been a great degree of immobility in housing. Most of the housing in Cuba was built after the revolution. But the old houses, the grand old houses in Havana, in Vedado, the houses that are now not in really good shape in old Havana, but they're location. Those folks are the ones best able to turn their house into a paladar. Some houses just incredibly have lived through a couple of centuries and they still look kind of new.
Does
That makes it
everybody
good.
understand what a paladar means?
Oh,
Palace?
Okay.
Palace or fancy place?
No.
It came from pellet, it came originally from the pellet that had to do with the taste because it came from a Brazilian soap opera where the people in the story had this restaurant that they called Paladar.
It's a home-based, it's a family-run restaurant. That is
I
called
see.
a paladar.
And there are several restrictions.
So these are like bed and breakfasts?
Sort of,
Without
but
a bed.
yes, that's what that is.
There are those who are bed and breakfast, and there are those who are just purely restaurants, bars, and maybe, what do you call it, dance places at night. And that depends a lot then on your family. If your family inherited a really nice house, good to go. If your family inherited a really bad house, or one of the new block apartment buildings, the third floor, you'll never get a paladar going.
Do people own real estate in that country? You know?
The rate of home ownership in Cuba is far higher than the rate of home ownership in the US.
Really?
The problem is, a lot of it is bad housing and needs to be fixed, but it is their house.
Interesting.
Okay, him and then Mari.
Despite the euphoria of the relations being reestablished, I am skeptical and cynical about it. I think it's only another device to undermine the government ultimately. And without lifting the embargo, I really don't see much of an advantage. And my other real question is, what is the impact of the bankruptcy of Puerto Rico on the climate and the perception of the United States to help out other countries and be influential in the Caribbean when Puerto Rico is bankrupt and no money being promised from US and so.
Did all of you know that Puerto Rico is bankrupt?
No, I didn't know.
Yeah, they are.
Some did, some don't. There's a heck of a lot of Puerto Ricans that are moving out.
More in the
going
United
to-
States than in Puerto Rico.
Coming to the United States or
Yes,
mainland?
especially Orlando, Florida, which is becoming the new Puerto Rico. I mean, this is a huge translation of people, which is not mentioned very much in the media. The same media that keeps track of every Cuban that leaves Cuba for a better life to come here. Well, there's a lot of Puerto Ricans that are leaving their island for more money, for a better life here, and that does not show up. That, if they don't, I think if the US as a government does not do something to save that, it's going to get a really bad mark in the Standard & Poor's and like that. And then Puerto Ricans will have no access to finance in market, and then it'll be a real mess. So.
Well, how will that impact our credit rating overall? I mean, because
US credit
Puerto
rating?
Rico is part of the US, you know.
Yes and no. In this case, it is no. It is not part. It is controlled by the US, but the finances are not the responsibility of the US.
Really?
So in this case, the US technically is able to say, you guys messed it up, you guys figured it out, maybe we can help you a little here and there, we'll advise you, well, we're not gonna throw money at you, you've been wasting it. And that's where they are now. So there's services that are getting cut, education and being reduced in size.
So their financial rating is separate from ours? Is that
Yes.
what you're saying?
Yes. There's no different law applicable to, a state here could declare bankruptcy. Puerto Rico is not
It's a territory. It's a
permitted to go bankrupt.
I think Ben has a question.
So you talked a little bit about Batista and the problems during that regime. I've heard arguments from another Cuban American who was the hardliner sort of side of everything, who said that, and he lived through that era specifically, a little bit of Batista, and he left 10 years into the revolution or something, maybe less. And he said that really, yes, there was corruption, yes, there was casinos and mafia and all that, but me personally and my family, we didn't see any of that. We weren't allowed to go to the casinos. It didn't really affect us. Looking back, hindsight is 20/20, whatever, he argued that Batista was a benign dictator because that there was decent health care, there was decent standards of living. That's what he argued. And that in reality, it's sort of the perception of Batista as an oppressive, well, not as but Batista's regime as being an impoverishing, really bad time for Cubans is something that the Castros and in later eras, sort of has been, looking back, it's more convenient to make it look that way so that the communist revolution looks, more contrast. What would you say to that?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion like that. And we cite, for example, Cuba had X kind of production, or X kind of level of something, and the same year Spain had something lower than Cuba. Yes, but Spain had been blown out by the war, World War II. You know, it was World War II.
Spain didn't
was involved.
participate in World War II.
Franco.
Yeah, Franco, but not World War II.
But they had a civil war.
Yeah,
Civil
War.
War.
Well, they had
War.
a civil war, and then World War II came right after.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that was the sequence.
But you
So
said,
I'm not
you
comparing-
said earlier, or somebody said earlier, if things had been so nice under Batista, there would have been no reason for Fidel to come to power in the way in which he did. So I think this counters this argument that things were lovely under Batista. They might have been good for the upper middle class if there was such a thing.
What?
Well, there was a middle class.
You're right. Just giving some examples that they give these misleading citations. For example, they say there are X number of radios per capita. Yes, but that's because some families had 6 radios in their house, and then there's 6 houses in the countryside that had 0 radio. So the distribution of wealth was way out of whack. The services were
Like in the
way
US.
out of whack. So they may say, well, when there was government-paid health service in some places, but in Oriente, at the eastern end, there's a road next to the sea, where you can still see the marks, the crosses set up along the way. They're kind of like those fuzzy toy things that for kids who get blown out in Baltimore and DC. Well, those crosses were erected there because that's as far as the person who was sick or his family taking him got before the person died. And so they buried the person there. There was no access for the farm workers, especially those who were like sharecroppers and worked for the super big food companies, latifundists. Black people in general did all the hard work in the country. And even in the cities, there was a big disparity. During, sugar was all. The sugar economy was the major thing. The sugar economy employed a lot of people until the end of the safra, of the harvest. And then that employment got reduced only to maintenance workers and getting the machines ready. but a whole bunch of people just went poof, out of work, into the streets. There were a lot of things like this that would have been a problem as a background for any country, because it was a very unbalanced economy with the Batista and his cronies, the latifundist and the super owners, and then a whole bunch, a very fine line of professionals, and then the rest. At the time of the revolution, the average level of culture was third grade. Now, this is not a country of intellectuals. It was a country that could barely read. This is why the campaign of the Cuban government began right away. At that time, the percent of people who had a college degree was like 3%. So the professionals.
What is it now?
Oh, now they just well,
No.
the ability to read is like 99%. Essentially 100% by now.
I think,
Well, on top of these background circumstances that would be bad, really, for any country, and were somewhat enhanced by the fact that the amount of U.S. investment deformed that the economy in relationship to the rest of Latin America. For example, Cuba was importing more Cadillacs than any other country in the world in the Batista years. It also had 22,000 registered prostitutes in Havana, I think. But added to that, there was this other aspect of Batista, that he was totally brutal, it was the kind of dictator who says, just have him removed, kill him, torture him, throw him to the sharks. This is a favorite activity. Take him out there and throw him to the sharks. The blood was all over the place. The people who fought back were not just in the mountains. They were underground. They were in the trade unions. They were in the schools. They were everywhere. About 20,000 people were killed in the struggle to get Batista thrown out. So the idea, when somebody would tell you, we weren't affected by it, and really we didn't notice anything strange going on. No, because the news said it. So-and-so got killed, so-and-so got disappeared, so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. People knew. People are disappearing, people are dying, people are fighting. There's no way for a well-educated Cuban to say, just had no idea.
I think I just wanted to emphasize Verity's question about the impact of U.S. capitalism on the island of Cuba, because it seems like it's going to be coming in one way or another. And is that going to be, is it possible to have a healthy capitalist society, I guess is what I'm asking, and
There will be obviously.
and maybe that's not what I really want to ask. I want to ask is, can we continue to have a healthy society that is not, where people are not discriminated against?
We have yet to see how it plays out. But remember,
Because money talks, and money
yes, but other things
corrupts
talk.
also.
People, the Cubans want to change, but they don't want the medical system
They don't want
touched.
what?
They don't want the medical system touched. They don't want the system of free education touched. They don't want the system of support for the arts touched. The Cubans are not just cravingly looking for cash, because they understand this kind of other stuff at a higher level
Well, that's good to know.
has to be. Now, the possibility of capital penetrating is limited by country sovereignty. It is a general practice now that the U.S., when it makes an agreement with any country, says, okay, we're donor, you're the recipient, and we call the shots, and then they get pushed into a free trade agreement that puts up on the block all of, first calls for the privatization of everything, and puts it up on the block. Cuba is practically all state-owned. The U.S. would like to see that, all of it, it's like privatizing all of the country
Yeah.
at one time. And the Cubans are not gonna sign any trade agreement. They're part of ALBA, they're not part of ALCA. And let's say, for an example that a lot of people use, oh, there's gonna be McDonald's all over the place.
Yeah.
Well, no, why? Cuba is trying to promote
Maybe McDonald's.
the import substitution and the production of their own folks. They would like to see a Cuban chain of like maybe pork sandwiches or something. Why would Cuba say to McDonald's, coming in and wipe out our new entrepreneurs? It's, no, there's beginning at the top of the government, which is being, forget that.
Well, one thing, if I might, I like the last point that Lisa made. Why would we think that the Cubans would just allow this? Why would you think that they would allow companies to just come in and do whatever they want? The president of Cuba, the ambassador to the United States from Cuba, have given very hardcore statements that say, we will decide. It's not complicated, but it's a part of the propaganda that we're fed every day, that money is the loudest thing that speaks. So there's a battle that's going on right now, right? That we're gonna see open up a little bit more. And that is the fact that the US government, President Obama said it very clearly if you listen to him on December 17th. He said, the past policies have failed, it's time to do something else. What were the past policies? To overthrow the Cuban Revolution. What's the goal? To overthrow the Cuban Revolution. If one thing doesn't work, you try another thing, and that's what they're doing. So that's what the US government is doing. But let's keep our eyes focused. The blockade is still there, as Luis pointed out. Our right to travel to Cuba is still restricted. Guantanamo is still the prison house. Now, when you talk about democracy, think about the country that has the largest number of people in jail. 97% of whom never have a trial by a jury of their peers. 97%. It's all plea bargain. That's built in. The judges even say that. So you can't sell U.S. democracy here. They try, but you can't really sell it to most working people. So I think the Cubans are in a good position. They've won the victory. They held out for the 5 to get out of prison. They forced the United States to establish diplomatic relations. It wasn't done out of the goodness of Obama's heart. The companies who want to come into Cuba and reap the whirlwind, first thing you have to know is Cuba's a poor country and it doesn't have a lot of money to buy a lot of stuff from the United States. They're not going to have McDonald's on every corner. As Luis probably pointed out, they'll probably have Cuban pulled pork and Copelia ice cream all over the place, as opposed to this. So I think we've got to give the Cubans a little bit of a, what do you call it, a understanding that they know what they are doing, and that it's not just the United States that can just run roughshod. There's a reason why the United States government is isolated in Latin America, mostly around Cuba and the dictators that the United States supported. And there's a reason why the United States vote on the embargo is 188-2. Why doesn't the United States accept that?
Okay. Can I ask Paulette, please?
Yeah,
You had your hand.
just an observation, and it's not a correct parallel. Bermuda, I've been there 3 times, they have 1 Kentucky Fried Chicken in the entire, no McDonald's, no nothing. They don't want that stuff there. So I take heart from that, even though that's a capitalistic, but they don't have any huge brand names. And so they decided what they wanted to do, and I agree, Cuba will decide what it wants to do. It is.
I just want to make a comment, maybe question, something to discuss. The idea that we're talking about what Cuba wants, what Cuba can decide, Cuba can do this. I think that might be a little bit of a simplification because we sort of look at it as this abstract sort of thing, or maybe we're thinking all the people of Cuba will decide. Well, I think it's important, and my trip to Cuba I think helped to show this, that they are not, just as we are not united, just as we have, you know, huge amounts of variation in our beliefs. Cuba is not one united socialist bloc trying to defy the United States. There are certainly many people in that country who express opinions very, I mean, some of the very same statements I've been hearing here, I heard in Spanish in Cuba. But there are also, especially among the younger, dejected generations who didn't live through the revolution, who just see a society that gives them $40 a month, are much less likely to believe in this, want more capitalism. Of course, not all of them either. And also, just one more comment. None of those individuals that I've talked about, almost none of those, are directly or even indirectly responsible for decisions made by the Cuban government. Because there is, just as there is to some degree here in any other country, a gap between the individual or the beliefs of a society and what the government does, but especially in Cuba, where it is a single-party state, where other parties, as of recently, correct me if I'm wrong, have been allowed to exist but not really organize or meet. And I mean, the same family has been ruling for however many, 50 plus years. It's a little problematic to say Cuba wants this.
And then the Cuban Americans will have an influence too, probably.
I think that the lady in the red.
I just, you could mention the presence now in Cuba, and I saw it somewhat when I was there, it surprised me, of other European countries, Germany, particularly China. Is there a possibility that their presence there already can mitigate some of the things that we're talking, some of the worries we have about the Americanization of their society, that there is enough there is enough influence from the rest of the world that although they may let us in, doesn't mean they're going to need us at the level that we think they're going to need us.
I would say there's enough to not have to rely exclusively on the U.S. That is clear. And I cited the matter of rice, for example. That could be a good example of where Cubans might say, yes, we'll take a whole bunch. They're building up their own rice industry, but Cubans are among the world's biggest rice eaters. And they might say, yeah, we'll take this as opposed to something else. But when somebody else says, well, we want to buy the Malecón and turn it into a block of luxury condos, no, absolutely not. That is stupid, that's crazy, that's not ever going to happen here, period. They have options. And especially now that the world has started to move in even faster to work with Cuba, more and faster than ever before. And that includes significant European and Latin American countries and big Asian countries like Russia and China and so on. It's not a desperate situation. It's not a
One thing that I've not heard in this whole discussion is anything about how the Cuban people themselves are extremely entrepreneurial, extremely resourceful, and extremely industrious. They're not sitting there waiting for other countries to come in and tell them what to do. They know what they want to do. And I agree with the young man who said that, you know, there's a lot of discontent, especially among younger people. They may be unhappy with the way things are going, but they want to take care of it themselves.
Michael?
Is Cuba a member of the World Trade Organization? Because World Trade Organization has been pretty harsh on
I think they are.
countries and not protecting markets and things like local markets and all that. Is Cuba a member of the World Trade Organization?
Yes, I think they are, and they have a long-standing beef with the U.S. at the WTO, because long ago the WTO ruled that the Bacardi that the Havana Club brand, I think it was, belonged to Cuba, and the U.S. had to do something about that. The U.S. had passed a law, it's like the Bacardi law, that specifically exempted Bacardi on the matter of Havana Club rum, and so they would not do what the WTO says. That's the Congress now that passed that law under pressure from Bacardi and France. So the WTO may work in a certain way with Cuba, but if the U.S. wants to say, you and who else is going to stop us, there's nothing to do it. So we will see. This is one of the things that ought to be worked out in this process of normalization. We'll have to see where will the U.S. agree to take care of this.
And we'll take two more questions, okay?
This is commentary. I had heard a couple of weeks ago that Raul Castro, current president right now, will not run again, right? For his position. He will be stepping down in about 4 years. And that sounds like there will be new leadership at some point. The Castro brothers will not be running, anything, and there will be changes, I think, as new people come in. Someone assumes the presidency, unless they happen to be groomed by the Castro brothers or by their supporters to maintain the same policies. Unless that happens, I think somebody will be coming in with a different set of policies and a different rapportment towards the United States, where they may allow more capital to go into the country, because it is a poor country, and you said it yourself. There are things there like, they don't have any kind of structure for internet systems, and infrastructure. Those things, they don't have a banking system, or at least an American banking system in place as of yet, or a credit card system. And what the country needs is somebody who's very progressive, who's somewhat business oriented, who will come in and decide, that we need these things, because, Cuba is not that progressive. They're not prosperous. And in order for Cuba to continue as a prosperous nation.
Depends what you define by progressive. Let me. I haven't said very much, but let me tell you the reason why my email is Cuba is Hope has a long history. Okay, and one, because I wanted people to ask me, why do you have an email that says Cuba is Hope? The two basic reasons is that I come from a country, Ecuador, in the Andean mountains, that could be a paradise. It has absolutely everything, from petroleum to shrimp to woods to, with climates that are just unbelievable, produces wheat and barley and potatoes, quinoa that is now the popular food for everybody who eats vegetarian food especially. But at the same time, comparing it to Cuba, Cuba's a little island that doesn't have those climates and those resources that Ecuador has. But to me, when I went to Cuba, and I go to Ecuador all the time, and I don't see children vending on the streets to survive, which is what I see in Ecuador. When I see a proud child dressed with school clothing because education stops, it's not